Hi, Josh.
Hey, Brink, how are you today?
I'm good.
Yeah.
For people viewing, I'm Brink Lindsey from the Niskanen Center.
Josh Cohen from Apple University and University of California, Berkeley.
I'll add that I'm newly of the Niskanen Center. I've been there about 4 months now. Before that, I was at the Cato Institute for a long time, but have moved quarters and happy to do so, and happy to talk with you again, Josh, after a while.
Very happy.
I think we spoke last shortly after the election, so nothing much has happened since then.
No, nothing.
Should be easy to cover everything.
Yeah, I think I've repressed that conversation, but yeah. But a few things have happened since then, including you published a book recently.
Yes.
Oxford University Press.
A book I co-wrote with Steve Tellis, who I think was recently on Blogging Heads with Glenn Lowry.
Yeah.
Steve is a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins. He is also a senior fellow at Niskanen Center. Our book is called The Captured Economy: How the Powerful Enrich Themselves, Slow Down Growth, and Increase Inequality. The focus of the book is the twin economic malaise that is dogging the U.S. economy. On the one hand, slow growth. On the other hand, high inequality. We don't try to address everything that's going on, but we try to address one underreported, underappreciated facet of this problem, which is the ways in which government policies are actively making matters worse, actively thwarting growth while at the same time exacerbating inequality.
Two bad birds with one bad stone.
Yes.
So here is my I've read the book. I enjoyed reading it, and I tried to summarize it. I've got 5 points, and tell me if I've got it right. So
okay.
We'll do a little level setting here. So the first point is the one that you just mentioned, which is the phenomena that you're concerned about, or this mix of slow growth and growing inequality. It's not that we're, buying more inequality by pumping up the growth rate, and it's not that we're slowing the growth rate to get less inequality. That's not a trade-off. It's two bad things happening at the same time. That's the phenomenon. And then the second thing is that you think that a root, not the only one, we'll come back to that, but a root that's sufficiently important to be worth talking about, is rent extraction based on politically artificially created scarcities.
Yes.
That rent extraction is a political failure that reflects an insufficiently deliberative democracy, which permits concentrated interests, especially when backed by large pools of resources, to establish legislation that creates those artificial scarcities with focused benefits and dispersed costs. Footnote, you've got 4 examples of this in finance, in occupational licensing, in IP, and in land use regulation. Fourth point, that third point covered a lot, but anyway, yep. Fourth point, that to create a more deliberative democracy, we need some reforms that are partly legislative, partly executive, and partly judicial, sort of a mix of greater expertise, both in the executive and in the legislative process, greater transparency, and also judicially a harder look at regulations reflecting what you describe as an egalitarian Lochnerism.
Yes.
Interesting idea. And then there's a fifth point, which I don't think is emphasized, but I think is present, and I think is also connected with some things that your colleagues, both Will Wilkinson and Jacob Levy, have been writing, which is that these reforms need to be driven by a kind of political coalition. The politics underlying this is a coalition. a political coalition of
Yes.
People who are concerned about inequality and people who are concerned about, skeptical about the power of the state. So those are my 5 points. The problem is that mix of bad things. The root is rent extraction. That rent extraction reflects political failure. The political failure requires a remedy both in executive, legislative, judiciary, and there's a political coalition that is needed in order to fuel the political reforms that will reduce rent extraction. Is that a fair?
A fair, excellent, pithy distillation of our book.
Well, nice of you to say. Nobody has ever said that I was pithy before.
So yeah, our the problem we're addressing is this double whammy of slow growth and high inequality. The mechanism that's making the problem worse. So the aspect, our diagnosis of the problem is rent seeking or regulatory capture. Rent seeking is economists speak for trying to increase profits through the political process rather than through trying to add value for customers. Political entrepreneurship as opposed to market entrepreneurship. And rent seeking or regulatory capture, where insiders somehow or another dominate the policy-making process to the exclusion of all other considerations, including the public interest. This phenomenon is best understood as both a corruption of democracy and a corruption of capitalism. For capitalism, the ideal is that the rules are set up so that people's incentives, people pursue their self-interest by helping others, by providing value to other people. When the rules are set up wrong and people can profit at the expense of other people, then then markets are not being structured appropriately, and therefore they're not performing appropriately. Likewise, the ideal of democracy is to take the raw inputs of public opinion and through institutional processes convert those into policies that serve the broad public interest. And here, the ever-present threat is that the political process, rather than serving the whole people, will be taken over by some narrow clique, and the state will basically be privatized to serve their interests. So this kind of democratic capitalist corruption, it's been around forever, as long as democracy and capitalism have been around. James Madison was worrying about the problem of faction back in the 1780s. The decade before, Adam Smith was saying that businessmen never get together but to conspire against the public interest. So these things are not new, but their buildup, the buildup of these kinds of rent-seeking policies over the past few decades runs counter to the general image that we live in a neoliberal era of deregulation. Some of that has been going on, but at the same time, government's interventions into the economy have been expanding in some areas and have done so in a way that's very profitable for people at the top and not so good for the rest of us. And this kind of distributional consequences of rent seeking, of it having a clear regressive impact, is something newish, something that is characteristic of the past few decades, but things looked different in the past.
Yeah, let me just on that last point, the distributional consequences for inequality. So at the very end of Capitalism and Freedom, the very end of the book, page 195.
Okay.
I checked her. Milton Friedman says, and I wrote the quote down, equality comes sharply into conflict with freedom. One must choose. One cannot be both an egalitarian and a liberal. I've never agreed with that. I, as you know from previous conversations, always have agreed with Rawls that egalitarianism and liberalism can be combined, that it's possible to reconcile in a very profound way values of equality and liberty, and that part of the purpose of democracy is to achieve that reconciliation when it's functioning well. But there is this alternative view, classical liberal view that I associate with Friedman and with Hayek. It's not libertarian in the property rights absolutist sense of libertarian that Will has recently been writing about, but it's an important point of view. And so you have been really for about a decade now beating the libertarian drum. That's how we initially got together on Blogging Heads.
Yes.
And I wonder what you think of that statement of Friedman's. The book is really focused both on slow growth, which is something I know you've been concerned about for a long time, for kind of Benjamin Friedman kinds of reasons. You wrote an earlier book on that. I know Steve is concerned about inequality. Your co-author, Steve Tellis. How do you respond to that statement of Friedman's on the value of equality?
Well, let me note the partial truth in Friedman's statement, which is that there is a tension between one conception of equality, of egalitarianism, and liberty, and that is if you allow people to be free to do what they want, to live their own lives by their own lights, and those people have differences in endowments and in preferences, then you are going to have freedom is going to lead to inequality of outcomes, just in the nature of things. So some level of inequality is an indicator that of pluralism and freedom, that people are doing their own things, and their own things aren't the same as other people's. So in that sense, I think some kind of inequality is inescapable. On the other hand, I think that freedom rests on a very strict egalitarianism along another dimension, equality of rights, equality of moral status. The whole liberal idea is that all people are morally equal and none has the right, was born with the right to rule over the others. And so the rules ought to be good for all of us. That is an important kind of equality. Beyond that, I do buy into the Rawlsian idea that society is an enterprise for mutual benefit, and so the rules of the game ought to be set up so that they are working well for everybody. And when that is not the case, and when lots of people, particularly at the bottom, are doing poorly, while people at the very top are doing very well, that is an indicator that the rules aren't set up right. Yeah. I would say that just in the abstract, you can't tell anything about the quality of a society's institutions from its Gini coefficient standing alone, and that is the kind of most comprehensive measure of inequality. Gini coefficient of 0 is complete equality of income. Everybody has the same amount. Gini coefficient of 1. One guy owns everything. Everybody else has nothing. The US and Uganda have pretty similar Gini coefficients. We're in the top 10 on the UN Human Development Index. They're below 150. So just the fact that people are unequal it doesn't tell you that much. It's why they are unequal, what the mechanisms of inequality are that really matters. And I think these days we have mechanisms of inequality in the United States that are problematic.
Yeah, on the issue of mechanisms and what you can and can't tell from the Gini coefficient, that statement that you can't tell anything from the Gini coefficient is something that both would be and was endorsed by Rawls, and is also endorsed by Thomas Piketty. He doesn't think you should look to the Gini coefficient. He agrees that it's about the mechanisms that are generating inequality. In case anybody thinks I'm misrepresenting his view, go look at page 262 of his book. I think I've got the page.
You got all the page numbers today.
Yeah, I know. I'm a numerologist at heart. The details. It's a day when people are making up all kind of bullshit, and so I'm focused on the fact that the details matter.
For you.
one reason, and that you were invoking roles, one thing that you were saying was it matters if the rules are fair. So that's, Rawls's idea, justice is fairness. What matters is that if the outcomes, you can't measure, you can't decide whether the outcomes are just or not by looking at the Gini coefficient. You got to know whether the outcomes emerge from a system of fair, rules, and then for him, and here I think there's a fundamental disagreement with the classical liberalism of Friedman and Hayek. It matters in judging whether the rules are fair that there's what he called fair equality of opportunity, not just formal equality of opportunity. Yes. Where you start out shouldn't determine where you end up. So people who are equally talented and equally able should have equal chances, regardless of the social circumstances of their origin. And then he also thinks that a fair system of rules is one that makes sure that gains at the top result in maximizing gains at the bottom, and maybe which is an equality, which is a concern about outcomes. I mean, it's not equality of outcome. Nobody exactly. The late Jerry Cohen, didn't believe in equality of outcome. Nobody quite believes that. That's a straw view. But there are arguments, the kind of Great Gatsby effect arguments that say that there is a connection between achieving equality of opportunity and the mobility that's associated with that, and having some mitigation of inequalities of outcome. Anyway, I'm not trying to persuade you to agree with Friedman. I just want to.
The classical liberal ideal, as well as the modern egalitarian liberal ideal, is of a society in which individuals are flourishing and lives of their own choosing. Classical liberals emphasize the personal responsibility ideal there, that you are the author of your own life, you make your own choices, and you deal with the consequences. And so long as you're not hurting other people or stealing their stuff, you get to do what you want. But you have to put up with the results of your actions. So that model is one that I believe in very deeply, and yet there is a big asterisk that I think classical liberals and libertarians have not paid due attention to, and that is that one's capacity to flourish, one's capacity to exercise autonomy, to exercise personal responsibility is not innate; it is learned, and what it means to exercise autonomy and personal responsibility today in the 21st century is a much more complex affair than it was in centuries past. And so therefore, the skills that are required, the preconditions for exercise of personal responsibility are more elaborate than they were before, which means basically you really need to pick the right parents. You really need to pick the right neighborhood to grow up in. And if you didn't, then there is a real hollowness to a personal responsibility ethic that ignores the fact that by the time we all judge everyone to be personally responsible when they reach their majority, 18 or whatever, some people simply do not have the capacity or have a diminished capacity to do what we're expecting everyone to do.
Right. And then if you say, but you're responsible for it, it's at best cynical and at worst, well, there are lots of names.
You picked the wrong parents.
It's a really bad, disgusting thing to do a lot of finger-wagging responsibilitarian bullshit when under the conditions that
when you're basically just finger-wagging and say you picked the wrong parents. Tough.
You picked the wrong parents. Yeah, right. So that's. I think what you're saying is important in that it feels to me a little different from where libertarianism was 10 years ago. Where I think 10 years ago, the way I saw the impulse behind libertarianism was there are a bunch of people who are egalitarians with liberal sensibilities and a bunch of people who are liberals who didn't particularly have egalitarian sensibilities, and neither one of them liked the invasion of Iraq and expansionist imperialist foreign policy. And neither one of them liked kind of, morals legislation, and so there were some, and they were having trouble finding homes where they were, and so there was some natural overlap. The position that you're taking now feels to me more embracing of the kind of egalitarian sensibility that I associate with Rawls. And I think there's another thing that I think is important it goes back to that last point in the argument that as I was laying it out, the fifth point about the political alliance, the politics of this anti-rent-seeking, pro-growth, pro-equality coalition. I'd always associated both the libertarianism of the more property rights absolutist kind and classical liberalism with a kind of very standoffish, sense about politics. Politics is a kind of a mess. It brings out the worst in people. And you may remember when we were at Stanford, maybe it was in 2009 or 10, and there was a forum on libertarianism, and I said that you classical liberals were always at the after party. You like the idea of celebrating gender equality and more racial equality and decent standards of living for workers, but it was always after it had happened because you didn't like politics too much. And in the things that I've seen from Jacob Levy and Will on recently in the debate with Ilya Soman, and also to some extent in the book, I also feel like maybe there's a little bit more of an embrace of the need. I mean, it's got to be a decent politics, but a little less standoffishness about the importance of politics, about collective action. Is that
I think on both fronts you're correct. The original sort of libertarian heterodoxy was to be relatively soft on redistribution while sticking to free market guns. I think my original relatively softness was focused just on kind of anti-poverty safety net. Since then, with ongoing developments and the complete cratering of the ideas of Social Security privatization, I've come to see that social insurance as well as anti-poverty policies are just part of the necessary institutional framework for contemporary society. So on that front, yes, and I recently wrote something about why conservatives and libertarians, even if they haven't become as wet as me, and even if they think the welfare state is bad news and breeding dependency on a much larger scale than I think, that they have good strategic and tactical reasons to prioritize other issues. So in particular, don't go after benefits for poor people while rich people are still feeding at the government trough.
Yeah. If I could just interrupt for 1 second, there's a great remark that John Stuart Mill makes in his autobiography, and it's a place in the autobiography. I can't give you the page number, but I can get it. It's a place where he says that he identifies himself as a socialist.
Yes.
And he says, he's explaining what that means, and he says that the principle that he who does not work shall not eat should not be applied to paupers only.
Yes, yes, good.
It's the trough feeding of the people who did, so to speak, choose the right parents. Yeah.
So first, don't take benefits away from poor people and normal people when rich people are still feeding at the state expense. And second, don't take away benefits from poor people until first you've taken the government boot off their neck. So expecting poor people to manage without government benefits while they are suffering government-caused harms is unfair. So I think for even if you, in principle, long for a day in which the world is such that people can take care of themselves with just private charity filling in the gaps, that would be a wonderful world to live in. That's nice. I just don't see it anywhere around the corner. But even if you think that, I think that there are very good reasons for classical liberals and libertarians to focus on other matters. As to politics, I think the events of recent years have really highlighted an enormous blind spot in libertarian classical liberal thinking, and that is that this idea of antipathy to politics has led libertarians to interpret the polling data on trust in government in a completely wrong-headed way. So, like when Gallup first started asking, do you basically trust the government to do the right thing? It was some incredibly high number in the late 50s, and then over the course of Vietnam and Watergate, by the 70s, it had cratered, and it's with occasional blips like during the 80s boom and right after 9/11, it's just the trend has been down, down, down. Libertarians have tended to interpret this as paving the way for libertarianism, that the scales are falling off people's eyes, they're seeing that government is a racket, and that this will then make them receptive to the idea of much less government. Turns out that's not really what's going on at all. When people say they don't trust the government, that means they don't trust established institutions. They don't trust the system we live in. It's not that they've lost confidence in raw power to change the world. It's not that they've lost confidence or lost that charisma has lost its appeal. And so what falling trust in government, what that poll question indicates is not growing appetite for libertarianism, it's growing appetite for demagoguery and strongmen. And so the notion that tearing down what we have now, tearing down the norms and institutions that support liberal democracy such as it is, warts and all, is the path towards a better world, has, I think, been exposed as completely wrong. That it's a path towards regress and ugliness and darkness. And so I think this really explains the kind of essence of the libertarian turn. We still, people like Will and me, still very much hold the value of key libertarian ideas, think they are really important spotlights to illuminate the world. Skepticism about centralized power, alertness to the possibility that power can be misused, captured by special interests, or simply that the unexpected, unintended consequences of interactions of government policies can produce perverse outcomes. And likewise, a real appreciation of the immense creative powers of specialization and exchange mediated by markets. So all of that, those libertarian ideas, we still think are great, but rather than deploying those ideas in an effort to smash the modern regulatory welfare state, we want to use those ideas to make the modern regulatory welfare state work better.
Yeah.
Because the alternative to the modern regulatory welfare state is not libertopia. The alternative is authoritarian populism.
Yeah. There was a great talk that I heard, it was about 20 years ago, more or less, by this Hungarian political theorist, Gaspar Tamás, who was also a member of the Hungarian parliament in the late 80s during the transition. And he had been a kind of Hayekian classical liberal / libertarian, use the words as you wish, and then had moved away from that position. And what I found really compelling about the talk was his description of the sensibilities and strategies that he had when he was in his, classical liberal, Hayekian period. And the idea was to root out any sense that collective action could do any good at all in the world, and to promote the idea that any discussion of collective action sat on a very slippery and steep slope down to, centralized, autocratic, blah, 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 blah. And so when I have read this stuff, it's partly in your book, but also in the things that Jacob and Will have been writing recently, which I mentioned before, it felt to me like there was a comparable lesson.
And that just sort of unremitting hostility toward or suspicion of collective action ignores the fact that that liberal democracy, the rule of law, the freedom, the actually existing freedom that people enjoy, represents a triumphant solution to deep collective action problems, and therefore it is the result, it is the fruit of collective action that we have created these rules of the game that allow people space within which to live their own lives. So there is no escape from collective action. The libertarian dream is of a world beyond politics, where we just have the rules of the game set up where basically government can't do anything, and therefore politics just kinds of goes away. But that's just not that's not in the cards. It is we're in the middle of politics always. There's no escape from it, and so it is through politics that we have to achieve good things and ward off bad things. And there's no alternative to politicking.
Speaking of politics and rent seeking, there's this, you may have heard about this, unless you've been away from Earth recently, there's this tax bill that's before the Senate today. There are lots of, so when I am not a tax expert, but reading a bunch about it, I did read the committee report that just came out yesterday that created the $1 trillion deficit problem for the Republicans. I mean, it didn't create the problem. It shined a light on what any rational adult probably already knew. But when I think about the things to be said about the tax bill that seem like a problem, like it's not going to add very much to economic growth, it's going to create massive benefits to the wealthy, it's likely to impose costs, if not in the near term, in the decade term, on middle and lower income, a bunch of middle and lower income Americans, increase the deficit by $1 trillion over a decade, according to the JCT. The process that's gone into making this sausage is incredibly awful. It'll have terrible impact on health insurance coverage, maybe terrible impact on universities because of taxing the investment income on the endowments of large universities and tuition tax waiver. So it's distributionally bad, it's procedurally bad, it's fiscally bad, very little growth effect. That it reflects rent seeking isn't on my list. Should it be?
Not really. To me, if you look at the actual policy substance of the bill, it's a mixed bag. There are some things in it I like. There are some things that are terrible. But my overall feelings about or assessment of the bill isn't shaped by a point-by-point analysis. It's very much sort of meta objections. The absolute absence of normal legislative process, the hyper-centralization of power, over-legislating, the just constant lying over and dissembling over what's in the bill, the monkeying around with the temporary individual, the gimmickry, so that you can simultaneously say it's not going to bust the deficit open because all the individual rates expire, and then tell everybody, don't worry about the individual rates expiring because we're never going to do that. So all of that is just a process so flawed and so motivated by this obsession that the most important thing we can do at this moment when on election night 2016, only 30% of Americans said they thought their kids were going to be better off than they are, that the most important thing we should be doing, the one legislative accomplishment that Republicans need to focus on, is shifting resources from ordinary people to rich people. It's just such a profound misreading of the world they're living in. It's such ideological blinkers that the whole enterprise just seems completely misbegotten to me, putting aside the policy details. Meanwhile, there is this larger issue that both sides focus so much on taxes to the exclusion of regulations. Especially Republicans think of tax cuts as the magic pro-growth elixir, despite the fact that there's just there are occasions when cutting taxes or reforming taxes and by lowering top rates can deliver greater efficiencies, which will produce temporary growth boosts. It is possible that some tax changes can permanently improve the incentives to innovate and therefore permanently tweak up the growth rate, or at least indefinitely tweak it up. But everything, all of the context about this bill just strikes me as a money grab by people at the very top who have captured a party, and it is not the kind of, it is a cognitive or cultural capture, so that I believe Paul Ryan really believes he is a benefactor when he wants to slash spending, social spending to finance tax cuts. He sees the tax cuts as a move towards justice, restoring money to its rightful owners, and he sees the slashing of social spending as not as hurting people, but as liberating them from crippling dependency. So the fact that this is just not the way the world really works is I think leads us to think that maybe they're not sincere, but I think Paul Ryan is genuinely sincere. But a lot of people around them are just, looking at their bank accounts and the degree to which the Republicans have sort of morphed into the worst caricature that progressives have drawn of them in years past. That caricature always being that there's a bunch of culture war distractions going on so that behind the scenes the plutocrats can do upward redistribution. I found much to object to about that characterization in years past, but now it looks just like, well, yes, that's what's going on.
Yeah, duh. Yeah. One last point related to these issues about the book, and let me just back up for a second and fully identify myself with the main thing that you just said, which is, whatever the blinders are, whether there's self-deception involved or bullshitting or lying or pick your favorite, whatever, that it's very hard to see the tax bill for anything as anything other than a grab of resources by people who've already got way more than anybody could possibly think that they need. It's disgusting. It's just straight.
Yeah, I don't know what the social problem is that is being addressed by this legislation. There isn't one. There is an ideological idea of what is going on that I think people like Ryan sincerely believe, and then there is just naked, cynical money grabbing, and the combination of those does not add up to to sound governance.
Yeah, it's toxic. So, toxic, and in particular toxic for people who are already doing badly and who are going to do worse. There was a point about the rent seeking. I don't have the book in front of me. I can't tell you the page number, but there was a reference to. It was about the kinds of rent-seeking problems that kind of, make you worried, which are not all rent-seeking worries you so much. Some kinds do and some kinds don't. And so there was a reference to the fact that, you kind of like the business model, if not the human model of Uber.
Yes.
Terrible in 1,000 ways, really completely miserable, but, not, maybe a decent idea. And then, you got these
we just talk about Lyft.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about Lyft. I deleted Uber a long time ago, so I only use Lyft. You got taxi cab drivers, you got a licensing system, looks like a case of rent seeking. And my recollection is that you say, yeah, but not the kind of thing that really is getting me too excited these days.
Yeah, I think the taxi cab monopolies are not good policy. They have produced lousy service for a long time, which the way in which Uber and Lyft exploited this kind of ambiguity in regulations. We're not taxi cabs. We're just a computer, we're just a site that's matching up riders and drivers. That gray area allowed them to offer a competitive service, and consumers leapt at it. It's the soaring market share of Uber and Lyft in markets where they operate is, I think, a clear indication that they made the world a better place. They were providing value for customers that they weren't getting under the old monopoly. But taxi cab monopolies are kind of rent-seeking. I think they're bad for economic efficiency and growth. They don't have the kind of distributional consequences that we're really worried about in the book. And there used to be a lot more of that kind.
They probably have the opposite distributional consequences, and that, of course, is my point.
Yeah. In the sort of New Deal era of the early era of modern activist government in the United States, there was a lot of government intervention that created rents, but a lot of the distributional consequences were downward redistributing or sideways redistributing. As to the former, labor legislation, obviously, minimum wage, rent control, universal service requirements, lots of things.
And making it not so hard for people to form unions.
Yes, I said labor legislation right off the bat. And even when the New Deal era was doing kind of traditional squalid rent creation, which is subsidizing big businesses, and there was a whole bunch of that, a whole bunch of cartelization of industries. Those big businesses back then employed lots of semi-skilled unionized workers, so the rents that they received were then passed along and shared with workers. We swept away a lot of that cartelizing economic regulation in the 1970s. Between doing that and opening up import markets, we made conditions very unfavorable for unionized industries, and unionization has collapsed since then. With that collapse have been follow-on political consequences. There just isn't a muscular political actor advocating for government interventions for downward redistribution like there used to be. And now the disconnect between technologically progressive industry and mass employment has occurred, so that the industries that are at the frontier, that are doing the exciting things and are therefore the ones most likely to attract the attention of regulators, tend to hire disproportionately highly skilled employees, and so when they get rents, those don't leak out very far. So those combination of political factors have changed the constant of rent seeking into something that is now having worrisome distributional effects.
Yeah, I mean, to crystallize the point, in the neighborhood that I live in, I work in Silicon Valley, as you know, and live in San Francisco, but more in Silicon Valley. There are lots of people around who, putting aside rent seeking, I'm sure they don't like rent seeking. They are not,
except when it comes to anybody building a house anywhere near them.
Yeah, exactly. There are lots of people around who are who hold, I think, two positions. One position is that they're worried about, concerned about the growth in inequality. And the concern, I think, is genuine. At least there are a bunch of people for whom it's genuine. So they don't like inequality and they don't like unions.
Yes.
And I think that's about as close as you can get to an inconsistent position, because there is nowhere in the world that has, that makes serious efforts to mitigate inequality where you don't have some decent level of collective organization by.
So I just recently wrote about this, and I will say I've spent my entire policy career opposing unions on trade policy in particular and celebrating their demise. But I wrote a piece for the American Interest a couple of months ago called "The End of the Working Class," where I recognized that what's going on with all this, what's wrong with the white working class. A lot of that is not just economic challenges. It's a sociological disintegration. It's lowering attachments to work, lowering attachments to family, lowering attachments to community. It's disintegration. And part of the integration of working class life that created a real positive working class identity was membership in unions. So I think there was a sociological loss, a profound one. At the same time that some of the aspects, so even if all of Wagner Act unionism was not my cup of tea as from an economic policy standpoint, some kind of collective organizations representing workers and giving them voice and giving them a sense of membership in a valued part of the society is indeed a gap in American life now that I think is a hole that a lot of people are falling in.
Yeah, I think your friends, Brink, are going to think you're not only wet, you're like sopping.
but I don't want to return to Wagner Act unionism. I would like to see some new 21st century version of worker representation, and we'll work on that.
The absence of collective organization has a variety of bad consequences, but I also think it's very hard to deliver on the effect of democratic politics, including a politics that seriously addresses the distributional issues that you're concerned about, that doesn't have that greater degree of collective organization. How that's going to happen is a matter that's either, I don't know if it's above our pay grade, below our pay grade, or orthogonal to our pay grade, but I don't have anything good to say about it. I don't have anything helpful to say about it. But, we've been talking about class. I wonder if we have a little bit of time left.
I don't know if maybe we can just stay here because there was something that I wanted to mention that we didn't get around to. And so we're running out of time. So maybe we'll just spend a few more minutes on this. Yeah. And that is the reform agenda that we outline in the book. The typical policy book, the last chapter is this limp noodle of a policy checklist of things you ought to do. We didn't want to write that kind of book because that's always an anticlimax. So instead, what we wanted to do was address kind of broad institutional fixes or reforms so not saying policy should be X, Y, or Z, but saying the policy making process should be changed in this or that way to make policy making less vulnerable to insider capture and manipulation. This, I think, illustrates an interesting contrast with classical liberalism, libertarianism as usual, in which the normal response to the problem of special interest influence is the reason you have so much lobbying is because there's so much to lobby over. If you had less government, you'd have less lobbying. And so the only real solution to the problem of faction is extremely narrowly circumscribed government so that there isn't that much to fight over. We reject that point of view in the book as a counsel of despair. Because the modern regulatory welfare state isn't going anywhere, and so if the only thing to do is something that's completely impossible and that nobody wants to do, then that just allows you to say, okay, all government's a racket and government never works well, and it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think we've seen that a lot in periods of Republican governance. People who believe the government's a racket and doesn't work well don't tend to do a very good job of running it. And also, it just flies in the face of the enormous variation in the quality of government across federal agencies, across states, across countries, across periods of time. So there is clearly better and worse politics, and the Mansur-Olson asymmetry problem of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs is real, but that is not the whole problem. That problem alone can be overcome. The other problems of bad venues, arcane, in the shadows, policymaking venues that give advantages overwhelmingly to insiders. The problem of information asymmetries. We think a lot these days about how to stop special interests, or progressives think a lot about how to stop lobbyists, how to stop that money. What we say is that hasn't really accomplished much. What you might think of instead of handicapping the lobbyists is fortifying, armoring the government, and that requires recognizing that lobbyists don't just bring money to candidates; they bring information to policymakers. The main thing that gets lobbyists' foot in the door is what's been called a legislative subsidy. They have the information that the policymakers need to govern because the regulated industries know a lot more about how things are done than the policymakers. That asymmetry is necessary, but it could be mitigated. You could have large amounts of in-house government expertise that enable them to evaluate more critically the often self-serving claims of interested parties. Instead, at the very same time, the scope of government has grown and the complexity of policy has multiplied. We've seen a slashing of the government's brain, slashing of congressional staff, slashing of congressional support agencies. Gingrich got rid of the Office of Technology Assessment. Right now, they're in the process of delegitimizing the CBO. Statistical and analytical capacities within the executive branch have been cut or not grown as well. And so this puts policymakers in a state of just abject dependency on the special interests that they try to govern. And when you have, financial executives who are incredibly rich and incredibly impressive and are rocket scientists, smartest guys in the room, telling you that if you do anything to change capital requirements, nobody's going to get any business loans, and all of this activity is going to move to London, and it will be an economic catastrophe for the United States. A 20-something congressional staffer that got picked because of some patronage deal is just not in a position to call bullshit on those claims. So these kinds of sort of institutional reforms to make government work better, to produce a policymaking process in which deliberation is more likely, is what we aim for.
Yeah. good luck on that.
Yeah, right. So somebody once described doing this kind of work as building, that is, coming up with good ideas, especially at unpromising times, as building landing strips in the jungle. You're hoping that someday the army is going to come and bail you out, and you want to prepare. So there may come a time when all of the awfulness that is going on now creates enormous momentum for going in the other direction. So just as the implosion of the moral squalor of the Nixon administration created a couple of year window for doing all kinds of institutional reforms, maybe we're not too far away from another one of those moments, in which case we ought to be ready with the right ideas. And so that's the kind of speculative game we're playing.
Yeah, I've spent more time in my scholarly career than I'd care to remember engaged in this kind of, some might describe it as fool's errand, but or building landing strips in the jungle. There is, in the kind of bibliographic spirit that some of my comments have been in, there's a very good article by Ted Lowy. It was in the late 1980s. Didn't get much attention, but it was it was called Two Roads to Serfdom.
Okay.
And he, this is the same Lowy writing about
I read End of Liberalism.
The end of liberalism, and it's, politics has degenerated into interest bargaining, and in this piece, it's a kind of argument exactly along the lines that you just described. So it's called Two Roads to Serfdom because he recognizes that there's a certain affinity between his hostility to modern administrative government and Hayek's hostility. But the fundamental difference is that he, again, in the spirit that you were just embracing, he says, look, modern affirmative state is not going away. So the idea of reducing the stakes of politics as a way of dealing with the deformations of politics is the wrong way to go. Instead, the way to reduce those deformations is by a set of political reforms. And he uses the term juridical democracy. Right. Doesn't say deliberative democracy because a bunch of us were laboring in the vineyards then to develop that idea. But he says juridical democracy. But it's the same thing about the same general idea about strengthening the legislative, in particular, in his case, legislative capacity, instead of having these broad, sweeping delegations of authority to administrative agencies and then letting them do the work of interpreting them and enforcing them, and then doing that in these, iron triangles that include the regulated industry. So I think there's a similar, similar spirit. But I do think of that when I've described to people, what the most important works of, in the 20th century political thought that I feel some affinity with, that is Rawls and Habermas. Right. I think that's the problem that you just described is the problem they're trying to address. What are the principles? What are the institutions? What are the forms of democracy that you need when you regard it as a fool's errand to get rid of an affirmative state, but you also recognize the values of the rule of law, values of fairness, and recognize the potential corruptions of politics gone bad. And anyway, it's our common problem, and we hope that we live long enough for some planes to land on the landing strip. On that cheerful,
talking to you, Josh.
Yeah, very good to see you.
All right, take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.